Um, Good morning to everyone, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Particularly, I'm guessing this week and in some upcoming weeks, because school starts for me next week. I know for a lot of people this week. These are coffee times. So at any rate, welcome. I am going to be talking about documents today, but before I plunge into that topic, I'm going to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. As you can tell, because the lighting keeps changing and the blue behind me, I'm at the ocean, my happy place, but I'm also my happy place every Friday when I'm with everyone here. I'm Annie Evans from New American History and delighted to be with you all. We gather each Friday. Please continue to engage in the chat. We love reading everybody's comments and reactions as Joanne brings a new document or a new topic to life each week. But we know that you guys have questions, particularly those who are back to school and you're using these talks as instructional materials. And so please make sure that those kinds of questions go into the Q&A, because that's where we will look for them in about 30 minutes and address your questions. So we are excited to have everybody here.
Excellent. Okay. And my apologies for deciding so late yesterday what I was going to talk about today. It's a sign that school is coming, that I was working on an assignment coming up at school and I was in the middle of it, and I was beginning to get very frustrated because I couldn't, it wasn't working out the way I wanted it to. And then I looked up and it was like 9 o'clock. Newbie. Okay, for those of you who are new, Newbie the history bird is very agitated and I don't know why. That's who you're hearing. Okay, now what I want to talk about today, as I suggested on Twitter, is documents, and in particularly government documents, and even more particularly presidential records. But I want to start by talking broadly about government documents, government records, and why they're important. And this won't be surprising, but I don't think it's being stated this plainly. And so I want to begin by doing that. Obviously, it's important to have these records preserved and put in the National Archives for the historical record, for as full an account of a presidency, in the case of presidential records, that we can get. And I'll mention briefly congressional records later. So certainly to record what happened and to create an accurate historical record. And we live in a time when it's really, well, actually, we are always living in a time when it's really handy passed around in accordance with what you would like it to be. Records, the receipts, are a handy thing to have for that reason. And that leads to my major point about presidential records, congressional records, which is not only is it important for the historical record, but also they can, what happens to records can fundamentally shape current politics and future politics. So they are political documents long after their immediate political life ends. And so that's one of many reasons. And you'll hear when I talk about the Presidential Records Act, you'll hear this go into play. But basically, these documents matter now, they could affect the future, and they explain or help us understand the past. So in essence, and I think I did tweet about this, the presidential records are supposed to go to the National Archives, where they essentially become public property. They don't belong to the president. Now, if people can't stroll into the National Archives and immediately see presidential records. There are all kinds of regulations about what can be revealed to the public and what can't, and presidents have the right to step forward. If the archivist asks them, can we show this? The archivist is really the National Archives, and the National Archivist are the people who are in charge of these records. But they are public property. They are the account of a democratic official that we put into office and who is ultimately accountable to us for what he or someday she does, right? So they are, it's easy, I think, under any circumstances to forget the degree to which many things are essentially public property, are ours, because of the nature of democracy, because of the importance of accountability, past and present. So anyway, there are all kinds of reasons, obviously, that records are important in a general kind of a way. Now, as far as before the 20th century, keeping records, and this holds true for presidential and congressional records, was a little bit hit and miss. And it's actually interesting. It's relatively late in the game that you begin to get people saying, perhaps we need an organized, sort of legally stated way of dealing with these. My first bumping up against the hit and miss nature of records is actually at the very end of my first book, Affairs of Honor. And what I write about there is a member of Congress, William Plumer, from New Hampshire, and he is very, very history aware anyway, but he's strolling around and he strolls into what's essentially a lumber room in the building in, I guess at this point, well, it's the Capitol at this point, because it's in the very beginning of Jefferson's administration, strolls into what is essentially a lumber room. And what does he find? All kinds of congressional records, like on the floor, between logs, waterlogged. So essentially, all of these congressional records were probably like in the room, which then was declared to be a lumber room, and nobody took care of the records. And he's horrified. Like, this is a record. How is this possible? And there is the formal congressional record, but what he's talking about here, all of these documents that are documenting, although let me back up a second there. There is a formal congressional record, but not in the form that it is today. I'll come back to them. At any rate, he sees all of these official congressional documents in very sad states of affairs. So he decides he's going to collect them. And then after that, even goes on a bigger historic project in which he's going to interview people who helped found the government. He decides it's his quest. He's going to preserve the history of the founding and the early government. He does that. And actually, ultimately, I'm going to get this wrong. I didn't look it up. I want to say that some of his holdings become part of the help create the Massachusetts Historical Society. I could be making that up, but he does go on to donate them and help create a major historical society with what he collected. But that's just a great example of the sort of hit and miss nature of records at that time. One other little example before I move into the 20th century, only because it amuses the heck out of me, and I don't think anybody knows about it, but it's such a great example of why it's important to have records not only kept, but to have access to them regulated. And this comes from William Maclay, Senator William Maclay's diary. And he's a senator in the first Congress. And he, at some point, he wants some kind of document from the Treasury Department. He doesn't like Hamilton. He doesn't like Hamilton's politics. He doesn't like Federalists, but he wants this document. So he goes to the Treasury Department and he asks for this document. And he's told, well, it's in Mr. So-and-so's desk. You know, have a seat. We'll look for it. I think it's in Mr. So-and-so's desk. So this Maclay is not a patient man, is sitting, waiting, and then someone else says, it is indeed in Mr. Blah Blah's desk. Come back and we'll get it from Mr. Blah Blah's desk. So Maclay at this point already has lost his patience after sitting in this antechamber for a while, goes back to Mr. Blah Blah's desk, and there's Hamilton. And what does Hamilton say? Oh dear, Mr. Blah Blah's on vacation. He's not here. And he took the key to his desk. I'm so sorry. Yeah, give you the document. Now, Maclay had been sitting for a really long time waiting for it. Everyone knew that this one particular individual who wasn't there had it. And after all of that, Maclay is just sent away like, oh, so sorry. And he fumes about this in his diary, which is why we know about it. Otherwise, we wouldn't. It's like early in-person red tape. And it's the Treasury Department doing its thing. At any rate, that's another example of the sort of hit and miss personal nature of records. Now, things began to change really not until the 20th century. Before in 1950, actually, is the first formal attempt to regulate records, federal records. In 1950, there's the passage of the Federal Records Act, appropriately enough, and it basically requires every federal agency to create some kind of ongoing program of record management and to do so in cooperation with the National Archives. Apparently, there had been a report written about ways to reform the way records were being kept. And this was one of the reforms that came out of that report. And it establishes, it describes the Federal Records Act as, quote, the basis for the federal government's policies and procedures for creating, maintaining, and disposing of federal records. Bang. And so that goes into effect. And now there's at least some understanding that there should be something that's being regulated, that the National Archives should have responsibility for something. For a while, people were still, particularly presidents, were still, there was a lot of wiggle room in what presidents did with their papers. It's really not until FDR in 1940 who creates the first presidential library, who kind of starts a precedent. Hey, you know what? Presidential library, and my papers can go there. Now, of course, this says nothing about which papers, how they go there, what's left out, but the idea of having a presidential library where papers, presidential papers live, begins with FDR. After that, people acknowledge records preservation is important. Congress really doesn't do much to enforce anything along those lines having to do with either congressional or presidential documents until the 1970s. The 1970s. So in 1974, 2 years after Watergate, Congress passes the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act of 1974. Note the word recordings in the title. They want Nixon's records pertaining to Watergate, and they want to put them in the National Archives. And ultimately, the government gets most of the recordings. Of course, there's those 18 and a half minutes that are never turned over, but it's Watergate and what it represented and the difficulty people were having in trying to get a full recorded account of what happened that first leads to this 1974 act about presidential recordings and materials. 4 years later, 1978, Congress passes a broader act, the Presidential Records Act, which required every president to archive official records, period. And it went into effect 1981 when Ronald Reagan actually began his presidency. So some of this is very recent, which is interesting. Now, the Presidential Records Act of 1978, I just want to set out what it does because it's handy to have this kind of information in current times. Essentially, it formally changed the legal ownership of the official records of the president from private to public. The Presidential Records Act of 1978 basically makes official records of the president public material. They are no longer private. It establishes public ownership of all presidential records, defines the term presidential records and what that means. So it's very clear what should be kept. It allows the incumbent president to dispose of records that no longer have administrative, historical, informational, or evidentiary value once the archivist has weighed in writing. Okay, so again, there are qualifications, and there's going to be another act to come. All of these acts, we're talking about federal documents, there are all kinds of qualifications about what needs to be revealed and what doesn't, and what can be retracted and what can't be. But the fundamental fact that presidential records are public property and that things can be destroyed only if the National Archivist basically says, you know, okay, of a sitting president. Okay, it also establishes that presidential records automatically transfer into the legal custody of the archivist as soon as the president leaves office. So that's all pretty clear, right? Here's what a presidential record is. It can't be messed with even when the person's in office. They have to ask the archives if something can be destroyed before really destroying it. And then it automatically, poof, this is an early poof, automatically goes to the National Archives. That's the standard. Now, as I started out by saying a little while ago, even before these acts, Congress wasn't always trying to enforce with a firm hand some of these records acts, but they became, given Watergate and given the offenses of Watergate in what, not only what had happened, but in trying to cover up the record of it. It's that offense, it's that violation of what was essentially a norm that caused the government to say, okay, no more of this, like we trust people to do the right thing. Okay, now there's an act. We can't trust people to do the right thing because President Nixon has proven that this could be problematic. It's always a president who steps forward and does something that logically enough causes people to sort of pick up their heads and say, hey, wait a minute, what's the policy? And most people are not, as far as people who are not in public office, doing what I did this morning and tracking my way through legislation to get the precise terms. Now, I'll add just here, as far as tracking that legislation. So the Presidential Records Act is, let me get back here. Too many pieces of paper, is 1978. In 2014, so now we're really recent, it gets updated. And in part, when you read the update, it's clear that one of the things that it's doing is dealing with electronic records. And here we get but her emails. It says that there should be a way to deal with creating and sending electronic records, and thus basically you can only use official email channels for government documents. Let me see if I have the right, I didn't put down the right text, but at any rate, it's talking about how if you're gonna communicate that kind of information, it's an official document, it needs to go through official channels and thus be part of this official, I need more coffee, process that has been put into place. And I have to add a personal anecdote here. So this is 2014. It was probably in the early 1990s, maybe. I worked at the Library of Congress for a while, and on the American Memory Project, which was digitizing congressional collections. And one of the things I got to do was go from division to division in the library to talk with people about what they were preserving and what we might be able to include in our collection of digitized sources. So I went to the manuscript division, which is where all, I spent a lot of time there for my most recent book. It's where presidential records are. It's where the records of government figures are. There's a huge amount of stuff there. But the meeting that I went to, and I wish I could remember the year, I'd have to track it back, but it was early enough that the discussion was, people are using less paper nowadays. They put like pink slips of paper that have like phone notes on them, like so-and-so called, right? Or there's phone messages. What are we collecting? And the meeting was, I wouldn't say necessarily alarmed, but it was an alert group of people who were discussing, and we haven't gotten to Twitter, we haven't gotten to email, who were discussing, given that there's all ways in which information is now being passed that we don't have access to, and phone calls are one of them. What do we collect? What should we be collecting? How does that work? And equally important, what format of technology should we be putting these sorts of things, phone calls, on? How should that work? Because this is supposed to be timeless. We're supposed to be creating an archive here that's, for the ages, that has all of this information, and we could place a bet on one form of technology, and in 5 years it might go boom, and then what do we do, right? We have to find a new technology. Really interesting conversation of a sort that we don't normally get to see at the Library of Congress, asking really good questions, and really good questions that were important, and show you that they're a sort of ground level example of how what's happening on the ground with documents is important, is recognized as important, and has historical and political significance, to the point that archivists really think carefully, even just about how the circumstances, the climate, the technology of how documents are kept. Anyone who's researched in the Library of Congress, and for a while, it was people who worked there were free to go into the stacks and walk around. This was a golden time for a historian, although I wasn't a historian yet, hadn't gone to grad school yet. But for a while, you could do that, and you could see the ways and, all of the ways in which things were climate controlled, and even sometimes when you were served materials as a researcher, all kinds of things in place to carefully preserve these records. They belong to the public. It may be the Library of Congress, but it's a government agency, and those documents, they're there to be accessible to Congress. Again, public property. So these are big, important questions, and I feel like at the current moment, there's a lot of discussion about where these presidential documents that former President Trump apparently took with him, where they were, who had access to them, very details, right? In the basement, was it climate controlled, whose hands touched them? All of these things are important, but in a sense, the most important part here is those records very clearly, very fundamentally should not have gone with him. They're not his. And this act says it explicitly. These records are public property. They do not belong to the president. So not only did he take these documents with him, but, and again, someone will have to track this down so I can say allegedly, he said, these are mine. These are mine. No. And so I wanted to have this episode, and I wanted to talk about this in part because it's pretty clear. And sometimes, particularly given all of the partisan, what do I want to call it? Sniping and yelling and arguing going on, it's easy to lose the simple fact that these were public property, they were ours, and they should not have gone with the president. As soon as he left office, they should have gone poof to the archives. He could keep personal documents, but he had to clear things with the National Archives. And that basically on some level just didn't happen. That's important. It's important on a lot of levels. It's important on a precedent setting level. So we have, the 1970s and Nixon, and suddenly a norm of sorts is violated and we have new legislation. Maybe this kind of violation requires some other kind of new legislation. I don't know. This kind of action requires new legislation, but because of another violation. Regardless, the simple act that the simple fact that this happened, I really need coffee, you guys. This would be a bad day for me to be recording my podcast. The simple fact that this happened is important, and I don't want that to get lost in the details that are swimming around. I see someone down below said, what is the punishment? And I don't know the answer to that question. So as long as I saw it on the bottom of my screen, I was going to answer. I did not look up punishments, and so I do not know that. And that would be a really interesting question. And since some of the people on here are so amazingly quick with online research, it would be fascinating to see if you could find an official record of what the punishment could be. Again, everything is soft and flexible in some ways, and sometimes in ways that they shouldn't be in the realm of politics. At any rate, I see I'm just about to run out of time. Look at that. People are like, here's the link. At any rate, my point today is, and it's a point that I make in different ways every week, is that, again, not just yay democracy, but democracy means the government is ours. It's ours. We give people power, and we have the right to take it away. We have a right to hold people accountable, regardless of their politics. They are accountable to us. There are all kinds of ways in which democratic governance, in a general sense, has that at its center, that ultimately it's government by the people. Now, in America's history, we've seen any number of ways in which that's ignored, cast aside, directly violated, whatever. So I would never, as a historian, say, and that is the perfect truth, and we've always done that. That has probably not been true with anything in American history. But the idea behind it, and the idea of what these records are, and the fact that we own them, in a sense, is a ground level acknowledgement of the fact that the government is ours. And ignoring it, and essentially saying, no, these are mine and I don't really care, that's not a really democratic action, she said diplomatically. The the fact that this is so important and that this has been dealt with in legislation again and again and again is important to note. And it shows how important these records are, how carefully over the years when things have come up that stretch limits, things have been updated. Records are vitally important. It's not a matter of they're mine, no, they're theirs. It's a matter of them being a public record, essentially public property, which still, if you want to see it, you have to get permission from the archive. So public property doesn't mean I want to be in there, but they're ours. Fundamentally, they're ours. They are history. They are a record of the immediate past, and they can fundamentally shape the future, either by establishing precedents that did happen, or if records get lost, didn't happen. They have a huge impact, even as pieces of paper or recordings. We are seeing in real time what happens when people are messing with facts, right? We live in a moment when it's very hard sometimes to tell what's real. When you, especially you go on social media and you see something and you're like, huh, sounds serious. Is that real in any way? I guess I'll now do some research. We live in that moment. And because of that, makes the National Archives that much more important, makes all the regulations that protect and provide its documents that much more important. There have to be some things that are facts. There do, and that might be challenged right now. But these acts and this process is part of an attempt to hold, create, save some facts. That's what it is. So anyway, I will stop there. I'm beginning to soapbox myself. Oh, and I see mug. You guys hear like the slightest change in the intonation of my voice, and you're right on it. For those who might be new, what I have done, this is the 125th episode. Mind-blowing. And what I've done apparently every week is find a mug that relates to the subject being talked about. I don't have 125 mugs, but I have managed to do this. And this one's going to be, in a sense, really obvious, but history matters. History matters. And today, in a sense, we're talking about how it matters in the immediate present. So, okay, I will stop talking. History does matter, yay history, and open things for questions.
All right, well, we've got lots of great questions as always, but one thing I love about our friend Ellen is she always geolocates her name. So I'm gonna let her question go first because I get to pick. So she always has Ellen from Hastings-on-Hudson, and I just love that for some reason. She's asking specifically about what is the relationship between presidential libraries and the National Archives?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually don't know the formal answer to that. My hunch of an answer would be that that's got to be a coordinated effort, because the National Archives needs to know where everything is, right? So it's not as though some things go to the archive and, oh, well, some things go to a presidential library. But what I don't know, it's a good question, is the formal mechanism for how that works.
I didn't realize till you were talking today. I looked it up. They are underneath, like if you go to National Archives facilities on Wikipedia, they do list the presidential libraries. I put that in the chat, but Carol Lee forgot to remind me to change it to everyone. So only you and John saw that.
Oh, very cool.
But I was like, how many? I visited like 9 of them, I think. And I don't remember, they don't have a lot of signage unless I'm just
No, well, because generally speaking, and my only connection in the past with presidential libraries has been to do research. And so, generally speaking, I think that the assumption is that people who go to these libraries and want to see records are researchers. And as in many archives, this is true in many kinds of archives, typically you have to show proof of who you are and what you're doing. And proof might be, I'm a professor at Yale University working on this project, fine, and you register who you are. And that's true, that's true with the archives at certainly at UVA, when you came in, you had to say who you are, faculty, student, why are you here? So I'm assuming there's not a lot of signage because actually it's not something that the public is supposed to necessarily see. Although if you wanted to use those records in some kind of a way that made sense, then I guess you probably would know anyway, but still that probably explains the lack of signage.
Yeah, I think my comment was I'm today years old when I realized there was a relationship there.
Oh,
All right. Linus put a really interesting question in the Q&A. Thank you, Linus. Did presidents before Nixon treat their papers as public property too?
Well, see, now that I don't know, because, and it surprised me. I guess it made perfect sense once I saw it. Like, of course, Nixon, and then suddenly like, bing, we're going to have some regulations. I don't know. I think you would literally have to go, well, you would have to do many things, but one thing you could do would be to go and look at individual presidencies and get a sense of this. The fact that there wasn't legislation and that there were norms involved, and we're seeing here, we live in a time when everyday norms get violated in one way or another. Again, I'm speaking without knowledge here, so I say that right up front. But I would assume it's just it was not as hard and fast for former presidents. I don't know. And again, it could be, as with so many things about our government, that presidents basically follow that norm and generally speaking gave their papers to the archives. And because so many of them, I think someone just said 15 presidential libraries, that in some cases that might have explained some of it. But can I say authoritatively, no former president snuck papers out and destroyed them? Personally, I do not know that. There may be someone out there who does know that, but I do not know that. The fact of the matter is, we live in a time now where that violation is recognized and there's legislation against it for very clear democratic reasons. So that's the moment that we're in.
So Francesca had asked in the Q&A, what happened to the presidential records before 1978? Are any of them in any public facing facility for before 1978?
Another good question. Before I answer that, let me just go back for a minute, because Gloria raised a point. Presidents do have the right of access to the papers. They do. They can see those papers, but they do have to say, I'm here to see this. So again, it's not happening undercover in any way, but it's a good point. I didn't want to lose track of that. So it's not as though the president sign over and they're like, oh no, I can't, and they can declare certain things restricted or need to be redacted. So that's an important qualification. Anyway, okay, I'm sorry. Remind me of what the question just was.
They were just asking, what about the records before 1978? Do we know what they did with papers before then? Are any of them in a public facing place that we can see them before the Records Act?
Again, these are great questions about all of American history. So I can speak specifically about early America, and I can, speak generally about other times in American history. Again, let's look, for example, at, I know what happened to, Thomas Jefferson's papers, right? Thomas Jefferson's papers, ultimately, he very carefully bound together many of the records of his presidency in a very careful order in 3 bound volumes and gave it to the government. Here you go. He meant it to be a record of his presidency. He very carefully included or didn't include certain things. It's called the Annus. I've written about it. It's really interesting. But there's a case in which a president took his papers and did whatever. He also, and many, not just Jefferson, but people in this period, founder folk, elite folk who assumed that their people would want to see their records, very often edited them. Either crossed things out, added things in the margins, even rewrote them, really crossed things out. So I've looked at some things, actually a Madison document and a Hamilton document, in which it's so, when I saw these things 1,000 million years ago, there was no way to sort of see beneath. Now you have all kinds of technology. I've just never gone back to look, but there's and in both cases, neither of these things is dramatically important, but Hamilton and Madison, or a descendant of Madison or Hamilton really didn't want the public to know. So in Madison's case, he was jilted by a woman. I believe her name was Kitty Floyd. That was, and actually that kind of hurts your heart, because if Madison did that, and in Hamilton's case, it was a slightly off-color joke about his upcoming marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler.
Ooh,
It was
juicy stuff.
which is, it's also a significant thing to think about, which in those cases, those are both personal documents, so a person could take them with them. But sometimes the dividing line between personal and official can be a little tricky, particularly in the past when people are playing much faster and easier with things. But many years ago, when I was first starting out as a historian, newbie, do you like democracy? He's not sure. Many years ago, when I started out as a historian, I was using these, the papers of Jefferson, the papers of whatever. And I realized, very early on, those are the official papers of. But personal letters between even politicians, like the Aaron Burr has the public papers and correspondence of Aaron Burr. You want to know about his politics, go to his private correspondence, right? It's not just the official records that contain important political content, which is also important to bear in mind. And that, as I suggested back with Jefferson, folks who were grappling with the fact that people might want to look at their records someday, and that's what Jefferson's thinking about. That's what others who are, destroying things or correcting things, what they're thinking about is, people are going to want to see these. Like like you can see Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in their old age correspondence, their wonderful correspondence in their old age, when they're thinking back to what they experienced and their presidencies and kind of arguing in an old friends kind of a way. One of the letters, an exchange of letters between them is basically, I was told that the postman wants to read our letters to each other. People are generally going to want to see what we wrote. And think about that, right? Because we take so much for granted right now about presidents and significance, and even the fact that we're having this conversation about presidential records and blah blah blah. And here are these people. The government is just founded. It's been in existence a little over a decade. This is like William Plumer, who goes into the lumber room. Records are all over the place, right? They're kind of going, like these records maybe they're important, maybe. And maybe we did something, right? We are actually, in some sense, founders. That's one of the things they're reckoning with, particularly Adams and Jefferson in their correspondence with each other. But this kind of stuff to me is fascinating because it's in some sense, the early part of the early republic is a moment of improv on a grand scale, in which people are trying things and failing things and ignoring things, and they don't know, right? So how would they know? How would they assume in advance, right, that they're fighting a revolution, and the revolution happens, and then Constitution, and then government, and now it's been here for 10 years, and ooh, we're on our fourth president. This is exciting. There's no assumption about anything at that point, right? I mean, generally speaking, that's a big statement. There's no assumption that it's going to last forever, the government's going to last forever. There's no assumption that the founders are the founders at that point, except for George Washington. So all of these things that we take for granted are still in the process of becoming, and that affects how records are being handled as well.
When you were talking about Madison not wanting everybody to know about the lady that jilted him, it made me think about a mug that I saw. Orange County is where Montpelier, James Madison's home is. I know you know that, Joanne, but I don't know if everybody knows that. And the mug was a picture of Dolly, and it said, "The real housewife of Orange County."
Oh,
I don't watch the housewife shows. I just
no, but that's hilarious.
But that made me laugh so hard. I'm standing in the middle of this store, and everybody around me is like, what is she like? This lady is losing it. I couldn't stop laughing. I just thought it was the funny end. Carolee, if I find that mug again, I'm going to send it to you. Okay, we've got great questions piling up here in the Q&A. Gloria asked, she said there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently, and I'm sure somebody will put the link in the chat. It said that the Trump warrant had no legal basis under the Presidential Records Act. She was asking if that was true, or do we know, did the Trump warrant have legal basis under the Presidential Records Act? I feel like you already answered that, but I just want to make sure.
Well, no, I mean, so it's an interesting question because there is a lot we still don't know about the whole thing. And which is kind of relates to what I said before, is that everyone's running off in all directions. And it's, a fact that this should not have happened and that has implications. But beyond that, I mean, I personally, maybe it's out there and I missed it, but I haven't read, I don't think we've seen like the search warrant and what it said and what the wording was. So I don't know if it's the Presidential Records Act that justified people to say that these things were stolen and then justified a search warrant to get these things. I don't know those mechanics. So I don't formally know if that was the act or if there was something more general, but certainly that would be a really logical way to justify a search warrant if you had evidence that this was true, right? Search warrants, you need to prove to a judge that they're necessary. And so you couldn't just say, I think they're bad things, we have to. So there's a legal process that took place for that. But I don't know if they formally cited the Presidential Record Act. It would certainly make sense.
So Linus, I don't know if Linus has a legal background, but he sure does put good stuff in the chat. Linus suggested it was the Anti-Espionage Act.
It could be.
I guess we'll see when we, like you said, we don't have everything yet, but
it could be. And that's, thank you, Linus. That's a good reminder about government and the law, right? Is that there are many different strategies and laws which one can deploy at given moments, depending on the outcome that you want. So this might be an example of that too. And this is partly why lawyers are so wonderfully useful if you're in trouble, because they know those things. But government as well. And there are strategies, and you can kind of get a sense of the churning going on behind the scenes in recent months. What do we do? What do we do? And this is part of what's going on, is particularly that kind of knowledge and that kind of strategizing. Oh, here we go. Linus has a lawfare piece on the Presidential Records Act. Wonderful. Look at, I love
the best links in this group for sure.
This group, if there's anyone who's new here, this is a reason why you need to come to this, because whatever I'm talking about, there are people who have been here loyally for roughly 125 weeks. 125 there are really educated people here in a variety of different categories, specialists in a variety of different categories, who are very good about sharing what they know and are quick to find links to what we're talking about. So in and of itself, and particularly today, since we're talking about an act, I haven't been able to look to see what's going on, but I'm just having a sense of it. And
the chat is on fire.
Excellent.
It always is, but today it's really on fire. Okay, Francesca has a great question that I kind of feel like we should have started with. That's my apologies. What constitutes a presidential record? Like, if we're going to break it down, especially because we know we have a lot of teachers who replay these in their classroom, what constitutes a presidential record?
Well, you would find that in that initial, actually, I can't remember, 78 or 1950. I think it's the 78 Act, but before I say that, yes. So in the 1978 Presidential Records Act, one of the things it does is define that. And I did not read the whole act. I made a list of things that it does and read some of them to you. I don't know, and that you could find that and read it. It very specifically says what a presidential record is for many of the reasons that we're talking about here. So that's a really good question.
That would be a great activity to do in a classroom, like have the kids annotate it.
It would. Or
Office's software where you can pull up the document and the kids can all comment. I mean,
it's like a record, or is it not a record, and what does it mean? That would, right? Is it official or not official? That'd be a really interesting way to get students to think about documents and credibility and facts and researching before you believe something, that could be a very cool classroom exercise.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got questions piling up. Dale said in a previous episode, when we talked about newspapers in the early republic, he's asking, would the early newspapers been the keeper of government records, so to speak?
Oh, okay. So, and that, thank you for reminding me of that, because I did want to mention that, because I said congressional record and then I reeled that back in. There was no formal congressional record of the kind that we have today in the early, you just said doobie doobie doo. Thank you. There was no congressional record of the sort we have today in this early period. Often what happened is you would have newspaper editors or people who worked for the newspapers, a handful of them sitting in each House of Congress and recording what they heard. In the early 19th century, and you can see this like in the John Quincy Adams papers and the paper, in his diary, right? He talks about the editor coming to him and saying, does this sound like what you said? You know, because it's gonna go in the newspaper. So in a sense, that acts as a kind of congressional record for a while. The problem with that is, obviously, they're not necessarily absolutely accurate, although they can't be way off base because partisanship is so extreme in many ways by that period that someone would call people on it, but still, it's reporters taking things down and then, you know, transferring them around and putting them in a newspaper, and that's the record. So newspapers were part of this process in a very almost formal kind of a way, and different newspapers got the privilege of having access, better access to Congress. The party in power would often favor a newspaper that was aligned with them and give them government printing contracts so that they could survive and thus keep publishing the newspaper, because newspapers often were not big money-making ventures. So the point is a wonderful one about the record, which is really the newspaper was at the middle of it at this point. And you can see all of the problems with that. I don't even have to list them with, you know, that process of people sitting and note-taking in different parties, like refusing to record what one person says because they don't like him, you know, they're all, which happened. There are all kinds of things like that. And the other thing, I actually meant to mention this before, because it's in my most recent book. It's an example of this, of the actual record being messed with. There's a moment, and it's when John Quincy Adams is in Congress. And I can't remember the specific thing that they're talking about, but John Quincy Adams says X happened the other day, and that's the precedent, and someone else says, no, it didn't. And they actually go to the record to look, and the clerk, the congressional clerk, who the book is centered around, suddenly he's in the middle of this, right? It's like, do you remember what they said? Is this what they said? Is this accurate? How accurate is this? So you, and the clerk in his diary is very upset because the answer might shape legislation that's being debated at that moment. So again, another example of all of the slippage in this process. Even now, there's less slippage because of legislation, but still, for a long time, norms.
Yeah. All right, we have so many great questions. We're running out of time. Okay, it says, what is the penalty and who gets penalized for violating the Federal Records Act of 1950 or the one of 1978? So what happens when you violate this is what
that's a version of what we already was already asked, which I still don't know the answer to.
Okay.
I mean, I actually, like I said, I came up with a list of key points, key things that the Presidential Records Act did. But I didn't go in great detail to see things like penalties. I suppose if I had another hour to think about this morning, I might have gone further. But what I mainly wanted to do this morning was understand the lines in how the process works, the lines in the process, what's allowable, what's not allowable, how that changed over time. Because I think, as I said at the end of my comments, it's a little blurry right now. And it's so easy on any topic, right? That you get into the weeds, and that forest is harder to see, and you got to remember the forest. So that's some of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Well, here we
And then-
go. Jim H, according to
Oh, fines are up to 3
tied to
years.
congressional oversight, fines of up to 3 years of imprisonment, up to fines, prison, barred from future office. Thank you very much, you guys. Okay. Thank you. This is, I'm telling you folks, if you're here for the first time,
It's a treasure trove. That's why, just so y'all know, we do save all the chats. We archive them in, is it Wakelet, Carolee, where you put them? But we also have a Slack channel. So if you're new, you have to request to be added to that. Just put, I want to be in the Slack channel, and put the email you prefer. And our friend Reese will help add you. If you're a teacher, once you're in there in the Slack, you can join the Teachers Lounge thread, where we specifically just geek out as teachers, or just stay in the general one. Okay,
and
so
all of these sessions are recorded,
yes,
archived online at the same address where
Yeah.
you can plug in here. So there's 124 other sessions sitting there if you want to.
Yep. And I'm putting the link in there. It's at ncheteach.org, and then I think you have to do /conversation.
Conversations. Yeah.
So you can have the videos if you're a teacher
there's
in your
an S.
classroom, and the
There's
chat
an S at
transcript.
an S at the end of conversations.
Oh, okay. John, I'm going to let you put the official. Okay, next question. What are some important documents? Tom wanted to know if you're aware of any documents that spent considerable amount of time either at the patent office or the Washington Orphans Asylum.
Wow.
Hmm.
I'm
not familiar with
specifically
the
no.
Orphans
I
Asylum.
know that's a really interesting one. Specifically, I don't know. But again, given the time I've spent not only dealing with politics in Washington, but it's basically living with a clerk in the House of Representatives for about a decade, and knowing all his papers, the degree to which things are all over the place, and things are kept, but there's a lot, as I said, I don't know if wiggle room kind of captures the degree of it. I'm sure it could be. I don't offhand, I can't say that I very specifically found that, but the only way, this is one of the interesting things about historical research. Sometimes you know what you're looking for and you know the places where it should be, but you would never think of going to, for example, the orphanage for any kind of records about politics. But if you were researching something else, you would stumble across them. This has happened to me where I've been looking for one thing and then suddenly I'm like, holy smoke, this is sitting here. And it's sitting there either because it was sent to this person and they kept it even though it wasn't about their life or politics, or someone found it and shoved it in. There are all kinds of ways in which documents, to say the least, walk around, and move from place to place. And it's part of, for me, the fun of research is trying to figure out the paths and stumbling occasionally across amazing things that people, either they knew that they were there, but didn't really know what they were, because they didn't look closely, because they weren't looking on that topic. There are all kinds of ways this is where I become an archive rat. There are all kinds of ways in which you really need to triple think when you're doing archival research. And there are all kinds of ways in which what you find, the order that you find things, the questions that you ask can really profoundly, fundamentally shape your understanding of what you're writing about, and then more broadly, history.
Dale was wondering, since the National Archives was established in 1934, who was in charge, or were there any records kept prior to that by a particular place or person?
Once again, see, this is, I will say here, people have always told me that when you're a teacher, it's important to say, I actually don't know the answer.
Yeah, Carolee and I say it all the time. We say
Right,
teacher,
and I do.
we say kids.
But and I readily will say, my interest was the sort of following the path of how people view documents, but the specifics, the mechanics, I looked up some of them. So I actually said, well, what happened before 1978? And then found 1950 and I found FDR. So I asked some questions, but I didn't look up penalties. So thank you guys for finding that. And I didn't go into any detail other than to talk about in the 20th century when actually people began to take official action. And it began to be, again, more of a norm. We are so much more aware of norms nowadays than we ever were before. And I've had both historians and political scientists say to me, like, unbelievable. And, I always feel when I think to myself, like, norms, who knew? I mean, we knew they were important, but we didn't really feel the importance and the significance of what happens in their absence until this era that we're in. Sounds like a really almost naive thing to say, except I know a good many political scientists and historians who have said a version of the same thing, because you live through something and you understand it in your gut in a way that you don't understand it intellectually. And there are a lot of things that a lot of political scientists and historians are understanding in a different way right now because of some of the unexpected, inexplicable, or just plain wrong things that are happening these days. That might be, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. So the couple of questions. One, I think Dale's got a lot of questions, but they're good, so good. He was asking when the records go to a presidential library or the National Archives, do they make copies so that there's a copy of that document in the other location? So if a presidential paper is at their library, does the National Archives have a copy for people like you that walk in and say, I'm doing research, or would you have to literally go to both to see everything?
That's a good question. I mean, again, that depends on the link between presidential libraries and the National Archives. Certainly, it is common that you see when you're looking through a collection a photocopy of something, whether that's because the archive that you're at doesn't own it, but they got a copy of it, or the original was lost. But there are all kinds of reasons why very often there'll be a lot of original documents and then some photocopies of things. And as I said earlier, people did all kinds of things with their even formal officials, with their records. And to this day, people are still uncovering and finding letters and documents. I mean, if you think of all of these big papers projects, like the papers of Thomas Jefferson, the papers of John Adams, those are they take decades, because what those projects do is try and collect every writing from or to that person, everyone. Think about that. So they go to archives, they ask questions, it takes decades, amazing projects. And it's the only way we have that kind of knowledge. And then they footnote them to explain who they're being talked about. I mean, those are amazing, ambitious, important projects. But a lot of what they're doing relates to what I'm talking about here, which is, where can we find documents? Can we find documents? And then every now and again, it's like, oh, someone put this up for sale, and it's this thing that we never knew. I have a list in my brain of documents that I know exist out there, and I've never seen them. And if one comes along, I'm going to know, that who knows where it is. I might be looking for something totally different, but if I see it, I will know what it is.
Well, I think one week, didn't you hold up a version of the Reynolds pamphlet that someone got you or you bought?
Yeah, no, I bought it. It's lurking behind me, as a matter of fact. Yeah, but that was actually one that would have been for sale. Like, hey, you want a copy? Yeah. So that in that case, that's a different issue, which is, holy smoke.
Yeah.
Hamilton decided to publish this pamphlet to clear his official name and acknowledge that he was an adulterer. But the pamphlet was something that people had access to. Yeah. So
okay, so Francesca's saying surely top secret documents are not presidential records. Like, she's asking, what is the difference between a presidential record and a top secret document? Because I guess she's referring to all those things that they said were labeled with certain levels of security.
Well, that again, that gets to the definition of what a presidential record is. It's also important to remember there is a Federal Records Act too. So we're getting again into the weeds of the legislation. But again, I would think if most of this, if not all of this legislation is online, sitting there in great length, that you could ask some of these questions and find some of these things out. And if you find them out, Slack might be the place to have a new discussion about like some of the very specific things here that would be interesting to reveal. But I don't know what someone just said, that there's a link that shows a lot of theft ongoing about something. I missed that entirely. But at any rate, people here, you guys, so knowledgeable. Anyway, my point is, I keep swinging back around to it, but I can't definitively say some things about records, and that, in a sense, is part of what I'm talking about today, is that over the years, there have been these attempts to be more precise in how they're handled. And it was Watergate that caused a really quick upswing in this. And again, because a norm, something was violated, and somehow people suddenly realized, like, there's no guardrail. Wait, and in many ways, I years and years ago, I did an exhibition at the Library of Congress on the history of Congress. And one of the things we talked about in the exhibit was, in many ways, history is a reactive institution, right? It's representative and reactive to other things. It often is not, proactive. And this is an example of that, right? Reactive. Hey, wait a minute, there's a whole mess with this going on. Let's do something. Or, political happening on a state level and bubbling up, and then Congress sort of has to deal with it. It's Congress. This is the understatement of the year. Congress, in a lot of ways, is fascinating because we assume it's something very straightforward, just like records. And there's a lot going on there that we don't know. That's pretty important. Oh my gosh, it's 5 minutes after. Okay.
I know, we're going to get in trouble with John.
We are. Okay. So let me explain what happens now. There, Cece, there's a link to notable thefts from the archives. Wow. Okay. I know about some thefts over the years from archives, because since I'm always at archives, you hear people say, as a matter of fact, I was once at the Library of Congress, and someone came up to me and said, have you seen, I'm not going to say what it was. It was like a really important document. It was like, no, do you not know where that is? And it wasn't that the Library of Congress is bad. It's just, again, who the heck knows where the document went. But let me say, again, thank you, as always, for coming and being here on a Friday morning to engage in the process of democracy, which is hashing over these kinds of questions, talking with each other about them, acknowledging things that seem right or wrong, talking with each other about what we think about things. This conversation, this kind of conversation, is fundamental to what democracy is. It's the freedom to engage with these ideas, to find evidence, to talk to each other, to draw our own opinions, and find ways in which we can learn more that might change or confirm our decision. So this is democracy in action. Thank you for being here. And there will be someone who knows precisely what's coming next. We are now going to segue into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on. It allows us to be a little more casual in our comments. So please, if you want to be part of the after party and you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are, and momentarily, poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching this on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and get into the after party through the website, and not the website, what is it? The link, the URL, ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will put you right back into the middle of the after party. So I look forward to engaging with some of you for the next little bit of time to talk about whatever we want to talk about. I look forward to seeing you next week, when I very well may discuss the dynamic of politics and what those dynamics mean, and because of the White House tweets. But at any rate, have a wonderful week. For those like me going back to school, I send you a fist bump of support. I'm
All right.